On a rainy night in Atlanta, a small family restaurant was only days away from disappearing forever. The owner had spent years building that place with her husband, but now she was standing at the edge of losing everything she loved. The bills were piling up, the future was uncertain, and she had no idea how she was going to save the dream they created together. Then, just when she thought the night would end like every other difficult night, the door opened. A man so tall he had to bend down just to walk inside stepped through the entrance. Everyone in the restaurant recognized him. It was Shaq. But what happened next was something nobody expected. Because he didn't walk in looking for fame, attention, or a special treatment. He walked in as a stranger looking for a meal, and within a few hours, that stranger would do something that would completely change a woman's life, save a family's dream, and remind everyone that sometimes the smallest moments can create the biggest miracles. The rain was still falling outside the restaurant that evening, but inside, Delphine Carter was doing what she had done thousands of times before, taking care of people. She had no idea that the person about to walk through her door would become one of the most important moments of her life. To everyone else in the restaurant, it looked like an ordinary night. A few customers were finishing their meals. Quiet conversations filled the room, and Delphine moved between the kitchen and the dining area, making sure everyone had what they needed. But for Delphine, this was another night where she was trying to keep everything together. Then the bell above the front door rang. A man stepped inside, and for a moment, the entire restaurant became silent. He was so tall that he had to lower his head and turn slightly just to enter through the small doorway. Rain covered his jacket, and his large frame immediately caught everyone's attention. The customers looked up from their tables, surprised by the unexpected arrival. Within seconds, people recognized him. It was Shaq. The reaction around the room was exactly what anyone would expect. Some customers stared in disbelief. Others quietly whispered his name. A few reached for their phones, amazed that one of the most famous athletes in the world had walked into their small neighborhood restaurant. To them, this was a celebrity moment. This was a story they would tell their friends later. But Delphine saw something different. She didn't see the basketball championships, the fame, or the millions of people who knew his name. She didn't see someone who expected special treatment. She saw a man who looked tired after a long day. She saw someone who had walked in from the rain looking for something simple, a quiet seat, a warm meal, and a moment where he could just be a normal person. Shaq slowly looked around the restaurant before saying anything. He noticed the small details that most people would overlook. The handwritten menu hanging on the wall, the family pictures near the register. The simple decorations that showed this place was not built with wealth, but with years of love and hard work. Something about the restaurant made him pause. It reminded him of the places from his own childhood, the kind of places where people didn't just serve food. They took care of each other. Delphine walked toward him with the same kindness she offered every customer who entered those doors. "Good evening," she said warmly. "Welcome in. We're happy to have you tonight." Shaq smiled and thanked her. His voice was calm, and there was no sense that he expected anyone to treat him differently. He looked at the menu and asked what she recommended. That simple question meant more to Delphine than he probably realized. After everything she had been carrying, after months of worrying about bills and the future, someone was standing in front of her not asking about her problems, not judging the size of her restaurant, but simply asking about the food she had spent years creating. She began telling him about the dishes customers loved most. She talked about the recipes she had perfected over time, the meals that reminded people of home, and the reason she believed food was about more than just eating. Shaq listened carefully, not like someone famous waiting for the conversation to end, but like someone who truly respected the person behind the cooking. He eventually chose his meal and sat down at a small table in the corner of the restaurant. There was no group of people following him, no cameras, no security, no special requests. Just Shaq sitting alone in a small family restaurant while the rain continued falling outside. As Delphine returned to the kitchen to prepare his order, she had no idea that this was not just another customer. She had no idea that the person sitting quietly at that table was about to become the first person in a long time to notice the struggle she had been hiding. She only knew that a customer had walked through her door, so she did what she always did. She cooked with love. Before anyone knew what would happen between Delphine Carter and Shaq that rainy night, it was important to understand the woman standing behind the counter. Because to most people, Delphine was simply the owner of a small neighborhood restaurant. She was the woman who greeted customers with a smile, remembered their favorite meals, and always made people feel welcome. But behind that smile was a story of love, loss, and a strength that had been tested more times than anyone knew. Delphine had built that restaurant with her husband, James, from the very beginning. They didn't start with a large investment or a team of people helping them. They started with a dream, a few family recipes, and the belief that hard work could create something meaningful. In those early years, they did everything themselves. They opened the doors in the morning, prepared every meal, cleaned every table, and stayed late at night making plans for the future. There were many difficult days, but James always reminded her that they weren't just building a restaurant. They were building a place where people could feel like they belonged. He believed that the most important thing a restaurant could offer was not just good food, but the feeling people carried with them when they left. Over the years, that little restaurant became exactly what James imagined. Customers came back because they felt more than just satisfied. They felt cared for. Families celebrated important moments there. Workers stopped by after exhausting days because they knew they would be welcomed. Older customers came in not only for the meals, but for the conversations with Delphine. The restaurant became a part of the community, and Delphine and James became part of the lives of the people who walked through their doors. But everything changed when James passed away. Losing him meant losing more than a husband. She lost her partner, the person who shared every responsibility, every decision, and every dream with her. Suddenly, all the things they once carried together became hers alone. She had to become the person who handled the finances, managed the repairs, made business decisions, and kept the restaurant moving forward. She had to learn how to be strong, even on the days when she felt completely exhausted. Every morning before opening the restaurant, Delphine followed the same quiet routine. She would walk into the kitchen, look at James's old apron hanging near the wall, and touch it for a moment. That apron carried years of memories. The mornings they prepared food together, the nights they laughed after a busy shift, and the life they built side by side. She would close her eyes and whisper, "I'm still trying." Then she would take a breath and say, "I'm still keeping our dream alive." Those words became the promise that carried her through the hardest days. She wasn't just running a restaurant anymore. She was protecting a piece of the life she and James created together. But Delphine was also fighting another battle, one that was even more personal. Her granddaughter, Emily, had been facing health challenges that made everyday life more difficult than it should have been for a child her age. Delphine watched the little girl try to stay brave, even when things were painful, because Emily never wanted her grandmother to worry. And that was what made Delphine fight even harder. She could handle being tired. She could handle working longer hours. She could handle carrying her own struggles. But she couldn't stand the thought of Emily facing difficulties without every possible chance to get better. So every day, Delphine carried the weight of two dreams on her shoulders. She carried the dream she built with James, and she carried the hope of giving Emily a better future. To the outside world, she was just a restaurant owner trying to keep a business alive. But the truth was much bigger. She was a woman holding an entire family together, quietly fighting battles nobody could see. And on that rainy night when Shaq walked through her door, he had no idea that the woman serving him dinner was not just a restaurant owner. She was someone who had spent years carrying everything alone, waiting for the moment when someone would finally notice. While Shaq sat quietly at the corner table that rainy night, enjoying the warmth of the small restaurant, he had no idea that just a few steps away, Delphine Carter was fighting a battle that had been slowly growing for months. To everyone who walked through those doors, the restaurant looked the same as always. The lights were warm, the food was being served, and Delphine was still welcoming customers with the same kindness she had shown for years. But behind that familiar smile was a woman who knew she was running out of options. The problems had started small, almost easy to ignore at first. A repair here, a late payment there, a slow week that she hoped would quickly pass. Delphine had faced difficult moments before, and she always found a way through them. But this time, the challenges kept coming faster than she could handle. The restaurant equipment that had helped her serve thousands of meals was getting older. The refrigerator needed repairs. The cost of ingredients continued to rise. Every unexpected expense felt like another reminder that keeping the restaurant open was becoming harder than ever. The biggest pressure was the overdue rent. Her landlord, Robert Hayes, had been patient with her because he knew Delphine's character. He knew she wasn't someone who ignored her responsibilities. She had spent years working harder than anyone, and she had always tried to pay what she owed. But Robert had his own responsibilities too. He had bills to pay, and he could no longer wait forever. Delphine knew the conversation she feared was coming closer every day. The possibility that she could lose the restaurant she had spent her entire life building. But losing the restaurant wasn't simply about losing a business. That was what made the thought so painful. For someone else, it might have been a building with tables, chairs, and a kitchen. For Delphine, it was the place where her entire life with James still existed. It was where they celebrated their first successful day. It was where they laughed after exhausting shifts. It was where they looked at each other during difficult times and promised they would keep fighting. Every corner carried a memory that money could never replace. She still remembered the day they realized their little restaurant had become something special. They had opened the doors not knowing if anyone would come. They had spent the whole day nervous, wondering if they had made the right decision. Then customers slowly began arriving. One table became two. Two became a full dining room. At the end of the night, James looked around at the people eating, talking, and smiling, and he told her, "One day, this little place is going to mean something to people." At the time, Delphine thought he was talking about the food. Years later, she understood he was talking about something much bigger. The restaurant had become a place where people felt cared for. It was where a tired worker could sit down after a long shift and feel welcomed. It was where families celebrated important moments. It was where customers came not only because they loved the meals, but because they loved the person who prepared them. That was why Delphine was so afraid of losing it. She wasn't afraid of starting over. She was afraid of losing a place that held so much love. And while she was trying to save the restaurant, she was also carrying another worry that never left her mind: her granddaughter, Emily. The medical expenses connected to Emily's condition continued to grow, and every appointment brought another reminder of how much responsibility Delphine was carrying. She never wanted Emily to feel guilty for needing help. Whenever the little girl apologized for causing trouble, Delphine always reminded her that family was there to protect each other. But when Delphine was alone, the fear returned. She wondered how she could keep the restaurant alive and continue supporting Emily. She wondered how much longer she could keep pretending she had everything under control. One evening after closing, Delphine stayed inside the restaurant long after the last customer had left. The chairs were placed on top of the tables, the kitchen was quiet, and the sound of rain against the windows filled the empty room. She slowly walked through the dining area, touching the backs of the chairs and looking at the place she had spent so many years protecting. She remembered the first customer who ever walked through the door. She remembered the first night they made enough money to believe their dream might actually work. She remembered James standing beside her, looking around the room with pride and saying that one day this place would matter to people. Delphine stopped near the table where they used to sit after closing. She placed her hand on the chair and looked around the empty restaurant. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel everything she had been trying to hide: the fear, the exhaustion, and the loneliness of carrying every responsibility by herself. Quietly, she whispered, "James, I'm still trying." The words disappeared into the empty room. She looked toward his old apron hanging in the kitchen and took a deep breath. She knew tomorrow would bring another difficult day. She knew the bills would still be waiting. She knew the problems would not disappear overnight, but she also knew she couldn't give up. So she turned off the lights, locked the doors, and walked away from the restaurant one more time. She didn't know that the man sitting inside her restaurant that night would soon become the person who would see the struggle she had hidden from everyone else. She didn't know that before the night was over, someone would finally ask the question she had been afraid to answer. "How much do you need to save this place?" Shaq sat quietly at the corner table, away from the attention that usually followed him everywhere. Outside, the rain continued falling over Atlanta, but inside the small restaurant, everything felt calm. For a man who had spent years being recognized everywhere he went, there was something comforting about sitting in a place where nobody was asking for anything from him. No cameras, no interviews, no expectations, just a warm restaurant, a simple meal, and a few quiet moments away from the noise of the world. Delphine walked back into the kitchen to prepare his order herself. She could have asked someone else to handle it, but that was never how she worked. She believed every customer deserved the same care, whether they were a regular who had been coming for years or a stranger walking in for the first time. She carefully prepared the meal that had become one of the reasons people kept returning to her restaurant. The kind of food that was not created to impress people, but to make them feel at home. When she placed the plate in front of him, Shaq looked at the food for a moment before taking his first bite. Then something changed. He stopped. For a few seconds, he didn't say anything. It wasn't the reaction of someone simply enjoying a good meal. It was the reaction of someone who had suddenly been taken somewhere else, a familiar feeling, a forgotten memory, something connected to a time long before fame, championships, and millions of people knowing his name. Delphine noticed the change but didn't say anything. She had seen that reaction before. She had seen people take a bite of her cooking and become quiet, because the food reminded them of someone they loved. That was always the thing she valued most about cooking. Food could carry memories. It could bring people back to moments they thought they had lost. Shaq took another bite, slower this time, paying attention to every flavor. He looked around the restaurant again, but now he wasn't just noticing the walls or the tables. He was feeling the story behind the place, the homemade food, the small dining room, the woman who stood in the kitchen making every meal with care. It reminded him of his own childhood. Before he became Shaq, before the fame and the success, he was just a kid growing up with a mother who worked hard to give her family a better life. He remembered the long days, the sacrifices, and the way his mother always found a way to put food on the table, even when things were difficult. She never complained. She never wanted her children to feel the weight of the struggle she carried. And sitting there in Delphine's restaurant, he saw something familiar. He saw the same kind of strength. The kind of strength that didn't ask for recognition. The kind of strength that showed up every day because someone else was depending on you. While Shaq continued eating, the other customers slowly returned to their conversations. The excitement of seeing a famous person in their small restaurant began to fade, and what remained was something much simpler. A man enjoying a meal made by a woman who had spent years putting love into every plate she served. Delphine watched from behind the counter as he finished almost everything on his plate. She smiled quietly, because, to her, seeing someone appreciate her cooking was always the greatest compliment. She had no idea that Shaq wasn't just enjoying the food. He was noticing the person behind it. After finishing his meal, Shaq sat for a moment, holding his drink and looking out at the rain-covered street outside. The restaurant had become quieter now. Most customers had already left, leaving only a few people inside. That was when Delphine's phone rang. She looked at the screen and immediately recognized the name. It was Robert Hayes, her landlord. For a moment, her smile disappeared. She stepped away from the dining room and answered the call, trying to keep her voice calm. "Hello, Robert." From where he sat, Shaq could not hear every word clearly, but he could hear enough to understand the tone. He could hear the hesitation in Delphine's voice. He could hear the worry she was trying so hard to hide. Robert wasn't calling to be cruel. He had always respected Delphine, but he explained that he had another buyer interested in the property, someone who wanted to turn the space into something completely different. He told her he needed an answer soon. Delphine stood quietly in the kitchen, holding the phone tightly. She tried to explain that she just needed more time. She talked about the upcoming events she had booked. She talked about customers who depended on the restaurant. She talked about how close she was to catching up. But underneath every word was the fear she didn't want anyone to hear. The fear that this might really be the end. After the call ended, Delphine stood there for a few seconds without moving. She looked around the kitchen that had been her second home for years. She looked at the place where she had cooked thousands of meals, where she had shared memories with James, and where she had fought so hard to keep their dream alive. Then she took a deep breath, wiped her face, and walked back into the dining room. She tried to act normal. She tried to put the smile back on. But when she looked up, she saw Shaq watching her, not staring, not judging, just watching with the quiet understanding of someone who had noticed something important. And in that moment, Delphine realized something. For the first time in a long time, someone had seen past the smile. Someone had noticed the weight she was carrying. And Shaq was about to ask the one question that would change everything. "Are you okay?" Shaq had walked into Delphine Carter's restaurant, expecting nothing more than a quiet dinner on a rainy night in Atlanta. He had no idea that the woman who served him that meal had been fighting a battle for years behind a simple smile. And Delphine had no idea that the man sitting across the room from her was someone who understood struggle in a way most people never saw. After returning from the kitchen, Delphine tried to act like everything was normal. She checked on the remaining customers, cleaned a table, and continued doing what she always did, taking care of everyone else before thinking about herself. But something had changed. The phone call from Robert was still on her mind. His words kept repeating in her head. The possibility of losing the restaurant, the place she had sacrificed everything to protect, suddenly felt more real than ever. Shaq noticed. He had spent his life around people who tried to hide things, athletes hiding injuries, business leaders hiding pressure, people smiling in public while carrying struggles nobody knew about. He recognized that kind of silence. It was the silence of someone who was trying to stay strong because they believed they had no other choice. When Delphine walked past his table, Shaq gently called her. "Excuse me," he said. She turned around with a polite smile. "Did you need anything else?" Shaq looked at the empty plate in front of him and smiled. "The food was amazing," he said, "but I was wondering something." Delphine waited. "Do you mind sitting down for a minute?" The question surprised her. She wasn't used to sitting with customers. Her place had always been behind the counter, in the kitchen, making sure everyone else was taken care of. But there was something different about the way he asked. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't sympathy. It was respect. So for the first time that night, Delphine stepped away from the role she had been carrying for years. She sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The restaurant was almost empty now. The rain outside had become softer, tapping gently against the windows. The busy sounds of dinner had disappeared, leaving only the quiet atmosphere of two people sitting together. Shaq looked around the room. "You built this place?" he asked. Delphine nodded. "Yes, my husband and I did." There was a small pause when she mentioned him. Shaq noticed. "He passed away?" Delphine looked down for a moment before answering. "Yes, a few years ago." She didn't say much more, but Shaq understood. Sometimes grief doesn't need a long explanation. Sometimes you can hear everything someone has lost just by the way they say a person's name. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. And Delphine believed him, because there was a difference between someone saying sorry because they felt they should, and someone saying it because they truly felt the weight of what you had been through. She thanked him and looked around the restaurant. She told him about how she and her husband started with almost nothing. She told him about the early mornings, the long nights, and the dream they built together. She talked about the customers who became like family and how this place became more than a restaurant. "It became part of our lives," she said. Shaq listened without interrupting. That was something Delphine noticed immediately. Most people listened while waiting for their turn to speak. Shaq listened because he actually wanted to understand. Then he asked the question she wasn't expecting. How long have you been trying to hold everything together by yourself? The question hit differently, because nobody had asked her that before. People asked if the restaurant was doing okay. People asked if business was improving. People asked if she needed anything. But nobody asked how long she had been carrying the weight. Delphine looked down at her hands. She wanted to give the same answer she always gave. I'm fine. But for some reason, sitting there across from him, she couldn't say it. Instead, she quietly admitted the truth. It's been hard. 2 simple words, but behind them were years of exhaustion, fear, and sacrifice. She told him about the restaurant struggling. She told him about the bills. She told him about trying to keep the doors open while also helping her granddaughter, Emily, through her medical challenges. As she talked, Delphine realized something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She wasn't being judged. She wasn't being looked at as someone who failed. She was being heard. Shaq listened as she talked about Emily, about the little girl's courage, and about how badly she wanted to give her granddaughter every opportunity to have a normal childhood. Then he asked softly, "Can I see a picture of her?" Delphine smiled for the first time in a while. She pulled out her phone and showed him a picture of Emily smiling, a child who had been through difficult moments but still carried so much hope. Shaq looked at the picture for a long time, because he saw something familiar. He saw the same kind of determination he had seen in his own family growing up. He saw a child fighting through challenges, and he saw a grandmother doing everything she could to protect her. When he finally handed the phone back, his expression had changed. This was no longer just a dinner. It was no longer just a stranger telling him about a restaurant. This was a person in front of him who had spent years giving everything she had to the people she loved. And in that moment, Shaq made a decision. He didn't know exactly how yet. He didn't know what it would take. But he knew one thing. Delphine Carter had spent years carrying everyone else. That night, someone needed to carry her. After sitting with Shaq that night, Delphine Carter felt something she had almost forgotten, the feeling of being truly heard. For years, she had carried every problem quietly, always making sure other people were okay before allowing herself to admit that she was struggling. But sitting across from someone who didn't know her history, someone who had no reason to care, yet still took the time to listen, made her realize how much she had been holding inside. Shaq didn't rush her. He didn't interrupt when she talked about James, the restaurant, or Emily. He didn't look at her like someone who had failed. He looked at her like someone who had been fighting a battle that deserved respect. And that was something Delphine wasn't used to. Most people saw the restaurant owner. They saw the woman who always smiled, always worked, and always found a way. But Shaq saw the person behind that smile. As they continued talking, he asked her a simple question. How much time do you have? Delphine knew exactly what he meant. She looked down at the table for a moment, because saying the truth out loud made it feel even more real. She explained that the restaurant was behind on rent, and that her landlord had already given her a deadline. She told him she was trying everything she could, but the numbers were no longer working in her favor. The restaurant needed help, and she didn't know where that help would come from. Shaq listened carefully as she explained everything. He didn't react with shock or pity. Instead, he asked questions. He wanted to understand not only the problem, but the person behind the problem. He asked about the restaurant, about James, and about Emily. When Delphine showed him a picture of her granddaughter, his expression changed. He looked at the photo for a long moment, seeing not just a child who needed help, but a little girl surrounded by people who loved her. That moment reminded him of his own childhood. He remembered his mother working tirelessly to provide for the family, never allowing her children to see how difficult things were. He remembered how she carried responsibilities without complaining, and how she always found a way to make sure her family had what they needed. Looking at Delphine, he saw that same strength. A person who was giving everything she had, not for herself, but for the people she loved. Before leaving, Jacques didn't make a big announcement. He didn't want to embarrass Delphine, or make her feel like she was receiving charity. He simply told her that he appreciated the meal, appreciated her story, and appreciated the way she had continued fighting. Then he asked for a piece of paper and wrote something down. Delphine watched quietly as he folded the paper and handed it to her. "Don't open it tonight," he said. "Go home and get some rest. Look at it in the morning." She wanted to ask what it was. She wanted to know why a stranger she had met only hours earlier cared so much. But something in his voice made her trust him. Jacques paid for his meal, left a generous tip, thanked her, and walked back into the rain. The door closed behind him, and the restaurant became quiet again. Delphine stood there holding the folded piece of paper in her hand. She almost opened it immediately. She was curious. She was confused. She wanted answers, but she remembered his words. "Look at it in the morning." So instead, she locked the doors, turned off the lights, and went home, carrying the one thing she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. She had no idea that the simple piece of paper in her hand would lead to a phone call the next morning. A phone call that would change not only the future of her restaurant, but the future of her granddaughter's life. The next morning, Delphine Carter woke up earlier than usual. She barely slept the night before. Her mind kept returning to the stranger who had walked into her restaurant, sat at a small table, listened to her story, and left behind a simple piece of paper that she still hadn't opened. She had spent years dealing with problems on her own, so the idea that someone she had just met might actually want to help felt almost impossible to believe. Before leaving for the restaurant, Delphine placed the folded paper on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment. Part of her was afraid to open it. She had learned over the years not to expect miracles. Life had taught her to work hard, stay realistic, and never depend on something that might not happen. But another part of her, the part that had been exhausted from carrying everything alone, wanted to believe that maybe this time could be different. Finally, she opened it. Inside was a phone number and a short message written in Shaq's handwriting. It wasn't a promise of money. It wasn't a dramatic statement. It was just a few simple words telling her to make the call, because someone was ready to listen. Delphine stared at the number for several minutes before picking up her phone. Her hands were slightly shaking as she dialed. She didn't know who would answer. She didn't know what to expect. She only knew that for the first time in years, someone had given her a reason to believe that maybe she didn't have to solve every problem alone. The person who answered was someone connected to Shaq's team, someone who already knew about Delphine's situation. They didn't treat her like a stranger asking for help. They spoke to her with patience and respect. They asked about the restaurant, her financial situation, and most importantly, Emily's medical needs. That was the moment Delphine realized Shaq had not simply listened to her story the night before. He had remembered every detail. He remembered the restaurant she was fighting to save. He remembered the husband whose dream she was protecting. He remembered the granddaughter who was the reason she refused to give up. The conversation continued for almost an hour, and for the first time in a long time, Delphine didn't feel like she was trying to convince someone that her struggle mattered. She didn't have to explain why the restaurant was important. She didn't have to explain why Emily deserved every opportunity to get better. Someone already understood. After the call ended, Delphine sat quietly at her kitchen table. The room was silent, but her heart felt different. The problems were still there. The bills had not disappeared. The restaurant still needed help. Emily's challenges had not magically vanished overnight, but something inside her had changed. For so long, Delphine believed being strong meant never needing anyone. She thought asking for help meant admitting she had failed. But that morning, she began to understand something she had never allowed herself to believe before. Sometimes strength is not carrying everything alone. Sometimes strength is having the courage to let someone stand beside you. When Delphine arrived at the restaurant that morning, She unlocked the doors the same way she had done thousands of times before. She turned on the lights, walked into the kitchen, and touched James's old apron hanging on the wall. But this time, when she whispered, "I'm still trying," her voice sounded different. There was less fear. There was more hope. And as she prepared to open for the day, she had no idea that the call she received that morning was only the beginning. Shaquille's decision to help was about to create a chain of events that would change Emily's future, transform the restaurant, and show Delphine that one act of kindness could reach much further than anyone expected. In the days that followed Shaquille's unexpected visit, Delphine Carter still found herself trying to understand what had happened. For years, she had become used to fighting quietly. She had learned how to solve problems without asking anyone for help, how to hide her worries behind a smile, and how to keep moving even when she felt like she had nothing left to give. But now, for the first time in a long time, someone had stepped into her life and reminded her that she didn't have to face every challenge alone. While the situation with the restaurant was slowly beginning to move in a better direction, there was one person who remained at the center of everything Delphine cared about: her granddaughter, Emily. Emily was only 9 years old, but she had already experienced struggles that no child should have to face. Because of her medical condition, simple things that other children took for granted often required more effort from her. Running across a playground, joining a game with friends, or keeping up with other kids her age could become difficult moments that reminded her she was different. But what amazed Delphine was Emily's spirit. The little girl rarely complained. Even on the days when she was uncomfortable or frustrated, she still tried to smile. She didn't want her grandmother to worry, and she often acted stronger than she really felt. Delphine saw that courage every day, and it was one of the reasons she refused to give up when life became difficult. One afternoon, after school, Emily sat at the kitchen table drawing while Delphine prepared dinner. It was something Emily loved to do. Whenever she felt overwhelmed, she would pick up her colored pencils and create pictures of the things she hoped to experience someday. Delphine walked over and looked at the paper in front of her granddaughter. It was a picture of Emily running, not walking slowly, not sitting in a chair, running. Her arms were stretched out, her face had a huge smile, and she was surrounded by bright colors. At the bottom of the drawing, Emily had written a simple sentence: "One day, I will run." Delphine looked at the picture for a long time. For most people, it might have looked like just a child's drawing. But to Delphine, it represented everything Emily was fighting for. It represented hope. It represented a child who refused to let her challenges decide who she was going to become. "That's a beautiful picture," Delphine said softly. Emily smiled and looked down at the drawing. "I'm going to do it one day," she said. "I know I will." Delphine smiled, but she had to look away for a moment because she didn't want Emily to see the tears forming in her eyes. She believed her granddaughter. She just wished the world could see what she saw every day: a child with more courage than most adults. That was one of the reasons Shaq's conversation with Delphine had affected him so deeply. When she showed him Emily's picture during their dinner conversation, he didn't just see a child who needed help. He saw determination. He saw a young person who still believed in possibilities even when life had given her difficult circumstances. And that reminded him of the people who had shaped his own life. The people who believed in him before the world knew his name. The people who supported him when success was still only a dream. Shaq understood that sometimes one opportunity could change the direction of someone's entire future. A little support at the right moment could give a person the chance to become everything they were meant to be. That was exactly what he wanted for Emily. Not just medical support, not just financial help. He wanted her to know that someone believed in her. A few days later, when Shaq returned to visit the restaurant, Delphine introduced him to Emily. The little girl was shy at first. She knew he was famous, but she didn't treat him like a celebrity. She treated him like a person. Shaq noticed that immediately. He sat down beside her and asked about her drawings. Emily proudly showed him the picture of herself running. He studied it carefully and smiled. "You know what I like about this picture?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "You didn't draw yourself as someone who was struggling. You drew yourself as someone who was winning." Emily looked at the picture again. Those words stayed with her, because sometimes children don't need someone to tell them their problems are small. They need someone to remind them that their dreams are still possible. And for Emily, that rainy night had brought someone into her life who saw her not for what she couldn't do, but for everything she could become. Meanwhile, Delphine watched the two of them talking together, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Relief, not because every problem was solved, not because the road ahead would suddenly become easy, but because for the first time, she knew there was someone else standing beside her, and that gave her the strength to keep fighting. After meeting Emily and seeing the little girl's determination firsthand, Shaq understood that Delphine's situation was much bigger than a simple financial problem. At first, he had wanted to help because he saw a woman who was struggling and deserved support. But after spending time with her family, he realized something deeper. Delphine was not asking anyone to rescue her. She was not looking for an easy solution. She was someone who had spent years working, sacrificing, and doing everything possible to protect the people she loved. What she needed was not someone to take away her strength. She needed someone to give her the chance to keep using it. That realization stayed with Shaq long after he left the restaurant. He thought about Delphine standing behind that counter every day, pretending everything was fine while carrying more responsibility than anyone knew. He thought about James's dream, the restaurant that represented years of love and sacrifice, and the little girl who still believed she would run someday. He had helped many people throughout his life, but this situation felt different. This wasn't just about solving a problem. It was about protecting something meaningful before it disappeared. Shaq knew that simply giving Delphine money would not be enough. A check could pay a bill, but it could not replace the years of work she had put into the restaurant. It could not erase the memories inside those walls. It could not bring back the confidence she had lost after fighting alone for so long. He wanted to help her rebuild, not just survive. So he began making plans quietly. He reached out to people he trusted and started looking at every part of the situation. He wanted to understand the restaurant's financial challenges, the repairs that were needed, and what could be done to give Delphine a real chance at stability. He didn't want a temporary solution that would only delay the same problems from returning months later. He wanted to create a future where Delphine could continue doing what she loved without constantly living in fear. When he returned to the restaurant, he didn't arrive like a celebrity coming to make an announcement. He came as someone who had made a promise. He sat down with Delphine and explained that he wanted to help her protect the restaurant and keep the dream she built with James alive. Delphine was quiet for a moment. Her first reaction wasn't excitement. It was hesitation. She had spent years being independent. She had built her life around solving problems herself, and accepting help was something that felt uncomfortable. She worried that people would look at her differently. She worried that accepting help meant admitting she had failed. Shaq noticed her hesitation and understood exactly what she was feeling. "Delphine," he said gently, "this isn't about saving someone who gave up. This is about standing beside someone who never stopped fighting." Those words touched her because they were true. She had never stopped fighting. Not when she lost James, not when the bills became overwhelming, not when she was afraid about Emily's future. She had continued showing up every single day. For the first time, Delphine allowed herself to accept that accepting help did not erase everything she had done. It did not make her weak. It did not mean she had failed. It simply meant she no longer had to carry the entire weight by herself. As the weeks passed, changes slowly began happening. The most urgent financial pressures were addressed. Necessary repairs were handled. Plans were made to strengthen the restaurant's future. But the biggest change wasn't something anyone could see on paper. It was the change inside Delphine. She started walking into the restaurant with a little more confidence. She started looking toward the future instead of only worrying about surviving the present. She still worked hard. She still cared about every customer. She was still the same woman who had built the restaurant with James, but now she no longer felt invisible. She knew someone believed in her. She knew someone saw the value of what she had created. One evening, after closing the restaurant, Delphine stood in the kitchen and looked at James's old apron hanging on the wall. For years, she had touched it and whispered, "I'm still trying." That night, she said those words again, but this time they sounded different, because she wasn't just trying to save what was left. She was building something new. And somewhere in that small restaurant, the dream she and James created began to feel alive again. As the days passed, Delphine Carter slowly began to realize that Shaquille's kindness had changed more than just the situation at her restaurant. For years, she had measured every decision by one question: how do I survive? Every morning, she woke up thinking about the bills, the repairs, and the responsibilities waiting for her. But now, for the first time in a long time, she was beginning to think about something she had almost forgotten: the future. The restaurant started to feel different. The same walls were still there. The same tables sat in the dining room. The same recipes came out of the kitchen. But the atmosphere had changed, because Delphine had changed. The fear that once followed her everywhere had become lighter. She still worked hard, but she no longer felt like she was fighting a battle that nobody could see. Customers began noticing the difference. They noticed that Delphine seemed happier. They noticed that she laughed more often. They noticed that there was a new sense of energy inside the restaurant. Many of them didn't know the full story behind what had happened, but they could feel that something had shifted. One afternoon, a longtime customer named Linda came in for lunch. She had been visiting the restaurant for years and knew Delphine well. As she sat down at her usual table, she looked around and smiled. "There's something different about this place," Linda said. Delphine smiled back. "What do you mean?" Linda looked toward the kitchen. "It feels like you're breathing again." Those words stayed with Delphine because they were true. For so long, she had been surviving. She had been waking up every morning carrying fear, trying to protect everything she loved. She had forgotten what it felt like to simply enjoy the work she had once loved so much. But Shaq's help had given her something more valuable than financial support. It had given her permission to hope again. One evening, after closing the restaurant, Delphine sat alone at the same table where she and James used to plan their future. She looked around the room and thought about how close she had come to losing everything. She thought about how easily the place could have disappeared and become just another empty building. But now, the dream was still alive. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small piece of paper Shaq had given her the first night they met. The ink had started to fade slightly from being carried around so often, but she still kept it, because it represented the moment when everything changed. She remembered how uncertain she had felt when she first held that paper. She remembered wondering why someone who barely knew her would care. Now she understood. Shaq had never seen her as someone who needed saving. He saw her as someone worth believing in. That difference meant everything. A few weeks later, Shaq visited the restaurant again. This time, it wasn't just about checking on the progress. It was about spending time with people who had become important to him. He sat with Delphine, talked with Emily, and watched the restaurant continue to come back to life. During their conversation, Delphine thanked him, not with a simple "thank you" for the help. She thanked him for something deeper. "You gave me more than support," she said. "You reminded me that what James and I built mattered." Shaq looked around the restaurant before answering. "I didn't create this place, Delphine. You did. James did. All I did was remind you that it was worth fighting for." Those words meant more to her than any amount of money ever could. Because the truth was, the restaurant had always been valuable. The community had always mattered. Delphine had always been strong. She just needed someone to help her see it again. And as the restaurant continued moving forward, another change was happening quietly in the background. Shaq began thinking about something bigger than one restaurant. He started thinking about how many other people were living the same kind of struggle. Hardworking people who had dreams, families, and responsibilities, but just needed someone to believe in them at the right moment. The night he walked into Delphine's restaurant started with a simple meal, but it became something much bigger. It became a reminder that kindness is not measured only by what someone gives. Sometimes the greatest gift is helping another person believe they can keep going. Months after Shaq first walked into Delphine Carter's small restaurant, the changes were becoming impossible to ignore. The restaurant that once felt like it was slowly disappearing was now filled with new energy. The tables were still the same, the recipes were still the same, and Delphine was still the same person standing behind the counter every day. But the fear that had once followed her everywhere was no longer controlling her life. She was no longer waking up every morning wondering if she would make it through another month. She was finally able to focus on something more important, building a better future for Emily. For Delphine, that was the greatest gift of all. The restaurant mattered because it carried James's dream, but Emily was the reason she had fought so hard to protect it. Every difficult decision she made, every sacrifice she accepted, and every night she stayed awake worrying about the future was because she wanted her granddaughter to have opportunities she never had. And now, for the first time in a long time, Emily had a new reason to believe. With the support that came through Shaq's connection, Emily was able to receive the care and attention she needed. The journey was not easy, and there were still many challenges ahead. But little by little, things started changing. The little girl who once had to watch other children run and play from the sidelines began working towards something she had always dreamed about: walking without fear, moving without hesitation, running. Delphine noticed every small improvement. She noticed when Emily took a few more steps than before. She noticed when the little girl became more confident. She noticed when Emily stopped seeing herself as someone limited by her condition and started seeing herself as someone capable of overcoming it. One afternoon, Emily came into the restaurant holding a piece of paper with excitement on her face. Delphine was preparing food in the kitchen when she saw her granddaughter standing there with the biggest smile she had seen in a long time. "Grandma, look," Emily said. It was another drawing, but this time it was different. It showed a girl running across a field with her arms stretched out and a huge smile on her face. But unlike the drawing from before, this one had something written at the bottom. "I'm getting closer." Delphine looked at the picture and felt her heart fill with emotion. She remembered the nights when she sat alone, worrying about whether she would be able to give Emily the help she needed. She remembered the fear of not being enough. She remembered wondering if she had failed her family. But standing there, looking at Emily's smile, she realized something. She had never stopped fighting for the right thing. A few days later, Shaq visited the restaurant, and Emily couldn't wait to show him her drawing. She ran over with excitement and handed it to him proudly. Shaq studied the picture carefully. He didn't just look at the drawing. He looked at the person behind it. "You know what I love about this?" he said. Emily looked at him curiously. "You didn't draw yourself waiting for someone to help you. You drew yourself moving forward." Emily smiled, because those words reminded her of something important. Her dream was not impossible. It was just a journey. Shaq had met many successful people throughout his life, but moments like this reminded him that the greatest victories were not always measured by trophies, awards, or money. Sometimes the biggest victories happened quietly, inside a child who decided not to give up. Watching Emily grow stronger also changed something inside Delphine. For years, she believed her role was to carry everyone else. She believed love meant sacrificing everything and handling every problem alone. But through Shaq's kindness, she learned that allowing others to help was also a form of love. It allowed her to keep standing. It allowed her to keep fighting. And most importantly, it allowed her to be present for the moments that truly mattered. That evening, after Shaq left the restaurant, Delphine stood near the kitchen where James's old apron still hung. She looked at it for a long moment and smiled. For years, she had touched that apron and whispered, "I'm still trying." But now, for the first time, she felt something different. She wasn't just trying to hold everything together anymore. She was watching the dream continue. She was watching Emily believe in herself. She was watching a new chapter of their family story begin, and somewhere deep inside, she knew James would have been proud. For a long time, Delphine Carter believed that the biggest problem in her life was the restaurant. She believed that if she could somehow pay the overdue bills, repair the broken equipment, and keep the doors open, then maybe everything would finally be okay. She thought saving the restaurant was the only thing standing between her family and losing everything they had built. But as the months passed and life slowly began changing, Delphine started to understand something she had never fully realized before. The restaurant was never just about the building. It was never just about the tables, the kitchen, or the meals that came out of the oven every day. It was about the people who walked through those doors. It was about the tired worker who needed a warm meal after a difficult day. It was about the families who celebrated birthdays there. It was about the lonely customers who came in, not only because they loved the food, but because they knew Delphine would always make them feel welcome. The restaurant was never just a business. It was a place where people felt cared for. And somewhere during all those years of fighting to keep it alive, Delphine had forgotten that what she created had already become something much bigger than she imagined. After Shaq entered her life, the first changes were the ones everyone could see. The immediate financial pressure that had been keeping her awake at night began to disappear. The repairs that had been delayed for months were finally completed. The bills that once felt impossible no longer controlled every decision she made. The restaurant had a chance to breathe again. But the greatest change was not something anyone could see on paper. It happened inside Delphine. The woman who once walked into the restaurant every morning carrying fear now walked in carrying hope. She still arrived early. She still checked every table. She still prepared meals with the same attention and love she had always given. But there was one important difference. She was no longer working only because she was afraid of losing everything. She was working because she remembered why she started. One quiet morning, before the first customers arrived, Delphine stood alone in the kitchen. The sunlight came through the windows, touching the same counters where she and James had spent countless hours preparing meals together. She looked around the room and felt a wave of emotion. For years, this kitchen had been the place where she carried her worries. It was where she cried quietly after difficult phone calls. It was where she stood alone after closing, wondering how much longer she could continue. But now it was becoming a place where she could finally feel grateful. She walked toward James's old apron hanging near the wall and gently touched it, just like she had done every morning before opening the restaurant. For years, she had whispered, "I'm still trying." But that morning, her voice was different. She smiled softly and said, "We made it." It was not because every challenge had disappeared. It was not because life had suddenly become easy. It was because she finally understood that she had never truly been fighting alone. As time passed, people in the community began noticing the changes at Delphine's restaurant. The walls were the same. The tables were the same. The recipes were the same. But there was something different in the atmosphere. The restaurant felt alive again. Customers who had not visited in months began returning. Some came because they had heard the story. Some came because they were curious. But many came for a much simpler reason. They missed Delphine. They missed the woman who remembered their favorite meals. They missed the woman who always asked about their families. They missed the woman who made a small restaurant feel like home. One afternoon, Linda, one of Delphine's longtime customers, walked through the front door. She had been coming to the restaurant for years, long before anyone knew Shaq would ever become part of its story. Delphine immediately recognized her. "Linda, it's so good to see you again," she said with a smile. Linda looked around the restaurant for a moment before answering. "There's something different about this place." Delphine smiled. "Different how?" Linda looked toward the kitchen where Delphine had spent so many years working. "It feels like you're happy again." Those simple words touched Delphine deeply because they were true. For so long, she had been surviving. She had been waking up every morning thinking about what problem she needed to solve next. She had been so focused on keeping everything from falling apart that she forgot what it felt like to enjoy the dream she and James had created. But now she was remembering. As more people heard about the restaurant's journey, many focused on one part of the story. They talked about Shaquille. They talked about the famous person who walked through a small restaurant door on a rainy night and helped a struggling owner. But whenever someone asked Delphine about what happened, she always said the same thing. He didn't just save my restaurant. He reminded me that it mattered. Because that was the part she wanted people to understand. Shaq's greatest gift was not simply the financial support. It was not the repairs. It was not the help that solved the immediate problems. The greatest gift was that he saw something in her that she had stopped seeing in herself. He saw a woman who had spent years serving others. He saw a grandmother who refused to give up on her granddaughter. He saw someone who had been carrying an incredible weight, but still found a way to smile at every customer who walked through the door. And sometimes, that is the kind of help people need the most. Not someone to tell them they are weak. Not someone to make them feel like they failed. But someone to remind them that their efforts mattered. Months later, Delphine stood outside the restaurant before opening. The morning air was calm, and for the first time in years, she looked at the building without fear. She looked at the sign above the entrance, the same sign she once thought she might have to remove forever. Now it represented something completely different. It represented survival. It represented love. It represented a dream that refused to disappear. Behind her, she heard laughter coming from inside. She turned around and saw Emily sitting at a table, drawing another picture. Delphine walked closer and looked at the paper. It was another drawing of Emily running. But this time, it was different from the first one. The picture was bigger. The colors were brighter. And at the bottom, Emily had written, "I'm getting closer." Delphine smiled as she felt tears forming in her eyes, because she finally understood the truth. The miracle was never just about saving a restaurant. It was never just about paying a bill. It was never just about fixing what was broken. The real miracle was giving people a reason to believe again. Delphine believed in the future again. Emily believed that her dreams were possible. And a man who walked into a small restaurant looking for a simple meal discovered that one act of kindness could reach further than he ever imagined. Because sometimes the greatest things in life do not begin with something big. Sometimes they begin with a door opening on a rainy night. Sometimes they begin with a stranger sitting down for dinner. And sometimes they begin when someone finally looks at another person and says, "I see you." After everything that happened, Delphine Carter thought the most important thing was that her restaurant had survived. For months, she had focused only on keeping the doors open, protecting the dream she built with James, and making sure Emily had the opportunity to receive the support she needed. She believed that once the crisis was over, life would slowly return to normal. The restaurant would continue serving food, customers would continue coming in, and the story of that rainy night would eventually become just a memory. But Delphine soon discovered that some moments do not disappear. Some acts of kindness create a ripple that continues long after the original moment has passed. The story of the small family restaurant in Atlanta began spreading throughout the community. People talked about the night when Shaq walked through the small doorway during a storm, sat at a simple table, enjoyed a homemade meal, and took the time to listen to a woman who had spent years carrying her struggles quietly. Many people were amazed that someone so famous would stop and help someone he barely knew. But the more people learned about what happened, the more they realized the story was never only about Shaq. It was about Delphine. It was about a woman who had spent decades creating a place where people felt welcomed. It was about the meals she prepared for families celebrating important moments. It was about the customers who came through the door after difficult days because they knew they would always find kindness waiting for them. Long before anyone knew Shaq's name would become connected to the restaurant, Delphine had already been making a difference in the lives of the people around her. That was what made the story so powerful. People were not inspired only because someone helped a struggling restaurant owner. They were inspired because they saw the value of someone who had spent years giving without expecting anything back. Soon, new customers began visiting the restaurant. Some came because they had heard the story online. Some came because they wanted to see the place where such an unexpected moment had happened. But when they arrived, they discovered something they did not expect. The most special thing about the restaurant was not the famous person who had once walked through the door. It was the woman standing behind the counter. They saw Delphine greeting every customer with the same warmth she had always shown. They saw her remembering names, asking about families, and making people feel like they were more than just customers. She had not changed because people were watching. She had not become kinder because the world noticed her. She had always been that way. One afternoon, a couple visited the restaurant after hearing about the story. They expected to find a place famous because of a celebrity connection, but after sitting down and experiencing the atmosphere, they understood why people loved the restaurant long before that night. When they finished their meal, they told Delphine, "We came here because we heard the story, but we're leaving because we understand why this place matters." Those words stayed with her, because that was exactly what James had dreamed of when they first opened the restaurant. He never wanted a place that was famous. He wanted a place that meant something. He wanted people to walk inside and feel cared for. And after all the struggles, after all the nights when Delphine wondered if she would have to close the doors forever, that dream had finally become bigger than she ever imagined. The impact of the restaurant's story reached beyond the walls of that small building. People began sharing stories about other acts of kindness happening around them. They started recognizing the small business owners, workers, and neighbors who quietly helped others every day, without receiving attention. Delphine's story reminded people that kindness did not always have to be something dramatic. Sometimes kindness was preparing a meal for someone who needed comfort. Sometimes it was taking a few minutes to listen. Sometimes it was simply noticing that another person was struggling and choosing not to look away. That was the real miracle that came from the rainy night when Shaq entered the restaurant. One person's decision to stop, listen, and care created a chain reaction that reached far beyond one family. One evening after closing, Delphine sat alone at the same table where she and James used to talk about their future. Months earlier, she had sat there filled with fear, wondering if she would lose everything they had built. But now, the room felt different. The restaurant was quiet, but it was not empty. The walls carried memories. The kitchen carried the smell of thousands of meals prepared with love. The tables carried stories from people who had found comfort there. Delphine looked around and finally understood something she had never seen clearly before. The world did not discover her restaurant because Shaq helped her. Shaq helped her because the restaurant had always been something worth protecting. The love had always been there. The meaning had always been there. It only took one person noticing for everyone else to see it. Before leaving that night, Delphine walked into the kitchen and touched James's old apron, hanging on the wall. For years, she had looked at that apron and whispered that she was still trying. But now, standing in the place they built together, she felt something different. She felt gratitude. "I wish you could see this," she whispered. "I wish you could see what our little place became." And in that quiet moment, Delphine realized that dreams do not always become bigger by becoming famous. Sometimes they become bigger because they touch more hearts. A small family restaurant became a place of comfort. A woman who thought she was forgotten discovered that she had always mattered, and a stranger who walked through the door looking for a simple meal left behind something much greater than help. He left behind hope. Months had passed since the night Shaq walked into Delphine Carter's small restaurant during a storm and changed the direction of her family's future. The restaurant was no longer fighting just to survive. The fear that once followed Delphine every morning had slowly been replaced by something she had almost forgotten how to feel: peace. She could finally walk into the restaurant without immediately thinking about overdue bills, broken equipment, or the possibility of losing everything she and James had built together. But even though life had become easier, Delphine never forgot the moment when everything changed. She never forgot the stranger who sat at a small table in her restaurant, not as a celebrity, but as a person. She never forgot how he listened when she talked about James, about the restaurant, and about Emily. She never forgot that he never looked at her as someone who needed to be rescued. He looked at her as someone who deserved to be believed in. That was what stayed with her the most. Not the financial help, not the repairs, not the problems that were solved. What stayed with her was the feeling that after years of carrying everything alone, someone had finally looked beyond her smile and recognized the person underneath. Someone had reminded her that she was not invisible, that her sacrifices mattered, and that the life she built with James was worth protecting. Delphine knew she could never truly repay what Shaq had done for her family. There was no amount of money or any simple gift that could equal the impact he had made. But she also understood that gratitude was not measured by the price of a gift. Sometimes the most meaningful things came from the heart, so she began preparing something quietly. She did not want a public celebration. She did not want cameras or attention. She did not want people to focus on Shaq as a hero or on herself as someone who had been saved. This was something more personal. It was a way for her to tell him that his kindness had reached a place much deeper than a restaurant or a financial problem. After closing the restaurant each night, Delphine stayed behind and worked on her surprise. She collected old photographs from the early years of the restaurant, pictures of her and James standing behind the counter when they were younger, pictures of the first tables they bought, and memories of the customers who had become like family over the years. She wanted Shaq to understand that what he helped protect was not just a business. It was a lifetime of love, sacrifice, and memories. She also wrote him a letter. It was not a long speech. It was not filled with dramatic words. It was simply the truth. She wrote about how, for years, she believed being strong meant never needing anyone. She believed asking for help meant admitting she had failed. But after meeting him, she learned something important. Accepting support did not erase everything she had accomplished. It did not make her weaker. It simply meant she no longer had to carry every burden alone. While preparing the gift, Delphine often thought about James. She wondered what he would say if he could see what their little restaurant had become. She imagined him standing beside her, looking around the dining room filled with customers and smiling the way he used to when they first opened their doors. She knew exactly what he would say. He would remind her that the restaurant was never only about food, it was always about people. When Shaq returned to visit the restaurant, Delphine immediately noticed something different. This time, there was no crisis between them. There was no fear, no difficult conversation, and no desperate need for someone to find a solution. It was simply two people sitting together, sharing a conversation like old friends. Shaq looked around the restaurant and smiled. The walls were the same. The tables were the same. The kitchen still carried the same familiar sounds and smells. But the most noticeable change was Delphine herself. The woman he had met on that rainy night was still there. Still humble. Still hard-working. Still caring for every person who walked through the door. But the exhaustion in her eyes had been replaced by confidence. "You look happy," Shaq said. Delphine smiled. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe." Those words meant more than she realized, because sometimes helping someone does not mean removing every difficulty from their life. Sometimes the greatest help is giving someone enough support to stand again, believe again, and continue moving forward. After they talked for a while, Delphine brought out the small package she had prepared. Shaq looked surprised. "What is this?" Delphine smiled. "Something I wanted you to have." He opened it slowly and found the collection of memories from the restaurant, along with her handwritten letter. He began reading quietly. The words were not about money. They were not about what he had given her. They were about what his kindness had helped her find again. Her belief in herself, her hope for the future, her understanding that she was never alone. When Shaq finished reading, he remained quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Delphine. "You didn't have to do this." Delphine smiled. "I know." She looked around the restaurant before continuing. "But I wanted you to understand something. You didn't just help me save this place. You reminded me why it was worth saving." Those words stayed with Shaq, because throughout his life, he had been able to give many things to many people. But moments like this reminded him that the greatest impact was not always measured by what someone receives. Sometimes it was measured by what someone gives back. That evening, after Shaq left the restaurant, Delphine stood near the same door where everything had started months earlier. A rainy night, a stranger walking inside, a simple meal, a conversation, a moment that changed everything. She smiled because she finally understood that kindness does not end when someone helps you. Real kindness continues when that help inspires you to become a source of kindness for someone else. For years, Delphine believed she was only protecting James's dream, but now she understood she was carrying something even bigger. She was carrying a message that every person deserves to be seen, every person deserves to be heard, and sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is not what they place in your hands. It is what they help you discover inside yourself. Years after that rainy night in Atlanta, Delphine Carter still remembered every detail of the moment that changed her life. She remembered the sound of the rain against the windows, the small bell above the restaurant door when Shaq walked inside, and the way everyone else saw a famous person while she saw something completely different. A tired person, looking for a quiet place, a warm meal, and a moment of peace. But more than anything, she remembered the feeling of being seen. She remembered that for the first time in many years, someone looked beyond the smile she showed the world and noticed the weight she had been carrying alone. The thing Delphine carried with her the longest was not the financial help, the repairs, or even the fact that her restaurant was saved. Those things changed her situation, but they were not the reason the moment stayed in her heart. What changed her was the reminder that she mattered. For years, Delphine had measured her value by what she could do for others. She believed she was important because she worked hard, because she provided for her family, because she kept the restaurant alive, and because she never allowed the people she loved to see how exhausted she truly was. After James passed away, Delphine quietly accepted the responsibility of becoming the person everyone depended on. She became the one who solved problems, made sacrifices, paid the bills, and continued moving forward, even on the days when she felt like she had nothing left. She thought being strong meant never breaking down. She thought love meant carrying every burden without asking anyone to help. But somewhere along the way, she forgot something important. She forgot that she was also someone who deserved care. That was what Shaq saw on the night he walked into her restaurant. He did not see a struggling business owner who had failed. He did not see someone who needed to be rescued. He saw a woman who had spent years fighting for the people she loved. He saw a grandmother who refused to give up on her granddaughter. He saw someone who had given so much of herself that she no longer recognized her own strength. And he reminded her of something she had forgotten. Her worth was not measured by how much pain she could endure. Her value was not determined by how many problems she could solve. She was valuable simply because she was Delphine. As time passed, people continued asking Delphine about the night Shaq entered her life. Many wanted to know what it felt like when someone famous stepped in and changed everything. But whenever she told the story, she rarely talked about the money first. She rarely talked about the repairs or the financial help. Instead, she always talked about one simple question. How long have you been carrying all of this by yourself? That question stayed with her because nobody had ever asked it before. People had asked if the restaurant was doing well. People had asked if she needed help with the bills. People had asked about the future of the business, but nobody had stopped to ask about the woman behind all those problems. Nobody had asked how tired she was. Nobody had asked how long she had been pretending everything was okay. And that was the moment Delphine understood something that changed the way she looked at life forever. Sometimes people do not need someone to solve every problem for them. Sometimes they simply need someone to remind them that they are not invisible. Years later, when Delphine watched Emily drawing at one of the tables inside the restaurant, she often thought about how much had changed. the little girl who once drew pictures of herself running, because she hoped one day it would become possible, was now growing stronger every day. She still had challenges ahead, but she no longer saw herself as someone limited by those challenges. She saw herself as someone who could overcome them. Delphine looked at her granddaughter and remembered all the nights she had worried about whether she would be able to give Emily the future she deserved. She remembered the fear of not having enough money, not having enough strength, and not knowing how long she could continue carrying everything alone. But now she understood that sometimes help arrives in ways people never expect. Sometimes hope enters your life through a person who simply chooses to care. The world often thinks miracles are dramatic moments. People imagine miracles as something impossible suddenly becoming possible. But Delphine learned that the greatest miracles are often much quieter. A miracle can be someone believing in you when you have stopped believing in yourself. A miracle can be someone reminding you that your dreams still matter. A miracle can be someone standing beside you long enough for you to find your strength again. That was what Shaquille gave her. Not just another chance for a restaurant, another chance to believe in herself. One evening, after closing the restaurant, Delphine walked slowly through the dining room. The lights were dim, the chairs were empty, and the familiar silence reminded her of the night everything began. She touched the tables where thousands of memories had been created. She looked toward the kitchen where she and James had spent years building their dream. She thought about Emily's drawings, about the customers who became family, and about the stranger who walked through the door on a rainy night and changed everything. She stopped near James's old apron hanging on the wall. For years, she had touched that apron and whispered, "I'm still trying." But now, after everything she had experienced, she smiled and whispered something different. "Thank you. Thank you for the dream they built together. Thank you for the people who walked through those doors. Thank you for reminding me that even the strongest people sometimes need someone beside them." Because Delphine finally understood the truth she had spent years forgetting. The greatest gift someone can give you is not always something they place in your hands. Sometimes it is something they awaken inside your heart. The belief that you matter. The belief that your story has value. The belief that no matter how difficult the journey has been, there is still hope waiting ahead. Years had passed since the rainy night when Shaq walked through the small door of Delphine Carter's restaurant and changed the course of her family's story. Time moved forward, seasons changed, and life continued. But the memory of that night never faded. It remained a reminder of how one simple moment, one conversation, and one act of kindness could create a change that lasted for years. The restaurant was still standing. The same place where Delphine and James had once started with nothing but a dream was still filled with the sounds they had always hoped for. Laughter from customers, conversations between families, and the comforting smell of homemade food coming from the kitchen. The walls had been repaired, the old equipment had been replaced, and the sign outside had been restored. But the most important thing that remained was something no one could see. The heart of the restaurant was still there. Delphine still arrived early every morning. She still walked through the kitchen before opening. She still checked every table and made sure every customer felt welcome. Some things had changed, but the most important things had not. She was still the same woman who believed that food was never just about feeding people. It was about making people feel cared for. And now, every time she opened the doors, she remembered that the restaurant was not only a place she had saved, it was a place that had saved her too. Over the years, Emily continued growing stronger. The little girl who once sat at the table drawing pictures of herself running was now taking confident steps toward the future she dreamed about. Her journey was not always easy. There were still challenges, moments of frustration, and days when things felt difficult. But she never stopped believing. One afternoon, Emily ran into the restaurant with a smile on her face, carrying a drawing in her hands. Delphine looked at the picture and immediately recognized what it was, another picture of Emily running. But this time, it was different. It was not a dream of something that might happen someday. It was a memory of something she had already achieved. At the bottom of the drawing, Emily had written, "I did it." Delphine held the picture carefully as tears filled her eyes. She thought about the nights when she had sat alone in that same restaurant, afraid that she would not be able to give Emily the future she deserved. She thought about the fear of losing everything. She thought about the moment when she believed she had reached the end of her strength. And now, standing there watching Emily smile, she realized something. The journey had never been about finding a way to avoid every struggle. It had been about finding the courage to continue through them. Years later, people would still talk about the story of the small restaurant in Atlanta. They would talk about the famous athlete who walked through the door on a rainy night. They would talk about the unexpected kindness that helped a family when they needed it most. But Delphine always hoped people remembered something more important. She hoped they remembered that before anyone helped her, she had already spent years helping others. Before anyone believed in her, she had already spent years believing in everyone who walked through her doors. Before anyone saw the value of her restaurant, she had already created that value through every meal, every conversation, and every act of kindness she gave. Because the truth was, Shaq did not create the magic inside that restaurant. He simply recognized it. He saw something that had been there all along, a woman who refused to give up, a family that chose love over fear, a place where people were treated like they mattered. One evening, many years after that first meeting, Delphine stood near the entrance of the restaurant after closing. The street outside was quiet, and for a moment, she thought about the night when everything changed. She remembered how close she had come to losing everything. She remembered standing alone in the kitchen, holding her wedding necklace, wondering if she had enough strength to continue. She remembered the small piece of paper Shaq left behind, a simple phone number, a few simple words, a small moment that opened a door to a completely different future. She looked around the restaurant and smiled, because now she understood something she could not see back then. Sometimes people enter our lives for only a short time, but the impact they leave behind can last forever. Sometimes a stranger can become the person who reminds you of your own strength. Sometimes a small act of kindness can become the reason someone finds the courage to keep going. Before leaving that night, Delphine walked into the kitchen one final time and touched James's old apron hanging on the wall. For many years, she had whispered the same words. "I'm still trying." But now she smiled and said something different. "We kept the dream alive." She knew James would have been proud, not because the restaurant became successful, not because people knew its story, but because it became exactly what they always wanted it to be. A place where people felt loved, a place where people found comfort, a place where kindness had a home. And somewhere in Atlanta, behind a small door that once seemed too ordinary to matter, a reminder remained. A person may walk into your life as a stranger. They may sit with you for only a few hours. They may never know the full impact of what they do. But sometimes, that one moment is enough to change everything. Because the greatest miracles do not always arrive with noise. Sometimes they arrive quietly. Sometimes they walk through a small door on a rainy night. And sometimes they leave behind a reason to never give up again.